All right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending upon where you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you again to discuss something that's kind of relevant today, I think, with all the media issues and the president and global leaders and religion and everyone who's fighting with everyone and, differing beliefs, differing political parties. I think it's very important that we talk about bias and we talk about stereotypes in particular, both things, because both things play a great part in how and why we make decisions and judgments about people. We all have biases, we all have judgments, and I think it's important that we know where and how we've developed these biases, and there's some science behind that. Another thing is stereotypes. Everyone seems to think that stereotypes are universally bad, and I get to be the bad guy and say, no, that's not true whatsoever. In fact, they exist for a reason. Whether or not they apply more so now versus in the past or in the future, or in whether or not they're perfectly accurate does not matter. Because stereotypes, bias, heuristics, those three things I mentioned on Thursday, they all serve a purpose. And I want to talk about that purpose. And I also want to explain some common biases that we all engage in, me included, because I'm human. And I want to explain why and how that works in the brain, and then what we can do about our biases if it's even important for us to manage them and deal with them differently. So in some cases, our biases and our stereotypes are important, and they serve a unique purpose that we should hold on to them for. So for instance, for me, I'm biased towards a scientific understanding of things. I will never take what someone says uncritically. I will never ever believe anyone when they make an assumption or an accusation or say something without any supporting facts. And if there are no supporting facts, I don't care. And the type of facts and how verifiable they are is also very important to me, which is why I don't pay attention to politics, because it's a bunch of ad hoc bullshit and ad hominem bullshit. That's why I don't pay attention to religious ideas or anything of that nature as well, because again, it's all speculation and it's all bias without any facts and any science. So I pay attention to the science of things because it's very, very important. I understand that that's my bias, right? So if we take a look at the origins of the word bias, we're really talking about, originally in the 16th century French, we're talking about kind of a tangential oblique line, a line that does not fit and fall in line in a parallel way or in a perpendicular way. So our biases are derivations from the norm. They're offshoots from the norm, right? That's what a bias is. So here are some common biases before I go into the science of bias that we all engage in. So with regard to, for instance, news media, almost anywhere in the world that's Western and industrialized, our news media is particularly biased, and they will engage in something called anchoring, just like we will when we watch it and believe what they say. Anchoring bias is basically relying too heavily on one reference or one source of information when making a decision or a judgment. So some piece of news comes out about Donald Trump on Fox News or CNN or whatever, Alex Jones or any number of people, Dave Rubin, pick your person, pick your speaker, pick your political news media pundit, and they will say, based upon the thing I just read, this is what is purportedly true. That's the anchoring bias, putting all your stock in one source. That's why you never see me do a talk and post on Patreon without usually dozens of sources. I don't make any statement definitively without having lots and lots and lots of sources that back up the point, or at least challenge it or somewhat support it. So that's the anchoring bias, using one source to prove a point or to rely on it as truth. That's why the Bible is bad, essentially, or any religious book is bad, because it's one unvalidated source. Anchoring bias. Then there's the authority bias, which is what people who listen to me might be playing into. The authority bias is valuing the opinions of authority figures who seem to know what they're talking about when they make opinions about things. So we think politicians are authority figures, we think government officials, we think news media personnel are authorities on subjects. They've done research, or they're seemingly well versed in the facts. And that's not always true. Hell, most of the, I forget, it was like 2 months ago, during one of the previous healthcare reform things in this United States, there was all sorts of rabble about the idea that no one in the Senate and the House ever really read the healthcare reform bill. So they're going to try and approve it or say no to it without having read it. So these authority figures haven't even read the fucking facts. Screw them. Okay? Then there's the belief bias. So this bias is very important because we all do it. So this belief bias is basically the tendency for us to say that an argument must be true if it's very believable, right? If it makes simple common sense, right? So that is a very important bias that we all go for pretty much every day because it helps us survive. And the final bias, and the one that I think I want to spend the most time on, which is most relevant for politics and all sorts of social issues and finances and economics and every aspect of our life, there's something called confirmation bias. This is where we seek out evidence that typically only confirms our point of view or our beliefs. So in science, using the scientific method, we're not only looking for evidence that supports it, but we're also wanting to publish evidence that disproves theories and disproves ideas. But if you take a look at news media in particular, which I hate news media. I hope they all burn down and die. And you can take that as a threat, that's what it is. I hope they all die. Because they're only living in the world of confirmation bias. Whether or not it's for or against something, 90% of stories are only looking to prove one point and seeking only evidence to prove the point. You're never hearing them talk about counterfactual evidence. Not alternative facts, just counterfactual evidence. It's the scientific phrase. So confirmation bias is when we actively seek out information that supports our own beliefs about things. So for instance, when I did research for this bias talk, I looked through almost 100 articles, and some of them supported what I was going to say here, and some of them did not support what I was going to say here, in terms of the science of bias and stereotypes, in terms of how good or bad they are for us, because my belief prior to this talk is that, for the most part, bias and stereotypes are bad. But my opinion changed once I read the research more. So here's another cool academic philosophy term in terms of bias called heuristics, right? These are basically mental shortcuts for understanding and making sense of things that are put in front of us, whether it's words or pictures or whatever. So my favorite heuristic, if you want to look these things up, my favorite one is called the availability heuristic. It's a template, a mental template of making sense of things based upon the fact that there's a lot of available evidence. You see this most often in the world, therefore it must be true. So for instance, with regard to news media and the availability heuristic, often we hear about how in low-income neighborhoods, a lot of crime happens, a lot of murder, theft, vandalism, destruction of property, police chases, things like that. So the availability heuristic, in our mind, the template that's created, seeing this over and over again in news media and hearing from other people who live there, is that, yeah, there's a lot of violence. Therefore, low-income people must be more violent and more prone to criminal behavior, right? Although that's not true. If you look at the research, there are different zip codes, different places in different cities and states where some low-income areas just have no violence and no crime whatsoever. If you go to the Midwest, where I'm from, a lot of low-income areas have very little crime and very little violence of any sort. So that's the availability heuristic. And the availability heuristic is basically what stereotypes are built on, right? So there are all sorts of stereotypes. There's a great South Park clip I wish I could play for you, but I didn't have the time to find it before this, about, you know, going to the, I think it's the Museum of Tolerance in Colorado, and they scream a bunch of, you know, racial and cultural obscenities, and then there's a wax museum full of cultural stereotypes. And the tour guide saying some are good and some are bad, like the Asian being a smart person and the Hispanic being a lazy janitor, all sorts of great stereotypes. These are hilarious, obviously, because it's South Park. And they're trying to prove a point is that stereotypes exist, and they exist for a reason. They exist because that's how we're built to function. So I want to talk about the science of stereotypes now. Before I go there, though, I just want to say hello to everyone. I appreciate you all coming out. I see that you're commenting. I know I'm talking about some strange things here, and it's a little off the beaten path for me. But again, this is the science of psychology of how our mind works. So I want to make sure that I do it justice. So with regard to science and with regard to the science of stereotypes and bias and heuristics, I did a lot of research on, in particular, confirmation bias. So the idea that we look for evidence that only supports our point of view because it's most kind of normal, and we don't want to disconfirm our beliefs. It actually causes pain when we disconfirm our beliefs. So research shows that humans and animals both engage in some kind of biasing and stereotyping behavior and stereotyping thinking about the people around them, the circumstances, etc., etc. And the evolutionary psychology research on why we have biases and why we have stereotypes shows this. The point of us having these heuristics, these shortcuts, these biases, what they do for us is they do a couple of things. A, they allow us to have an easier time processing, essentially. So our brain is a brilliant, wonderful mechanism with billions of connections and neurons, but it's easy for it to get overloaded with all the things we process in a given moment, all the sights, sounds, smells, experiences, thoughts. So we use stereotypes and biases and heuristics in order to minimize how much of our frontal cognitive resources are used in a given social circumstance so that we can make a decision more quickly and easily. Another thing that the research shows is that, with regard to bias in particular, people basically group based upon their bias. So in the United States, the number one way that we group, sadly and pathetically, I think, is based upon politics and party line. You're either conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican or moderate or libertarian or Green Party or whatever. And that's all bullshit. All of it is bullshit. Parties in this country are bullshit. And you can hate me or love me for that, doesn't matter, but it's the truth. Because it's tribalism. And one of the ways that we engage in tribalism is by having shared biases. We like to relate to people who think similar to us. That makes us feel safe. It's just that simple. Now, to be fair, intellectually honest, because that's my goal with all this, all these biases and the extent to which we participate in a very strong and intense way with like a political party or a group or whatever our tribe is, whether it's a racial tribe or a social tribe or a professional organization, the Illuminati, whatever. It varies, because some people in any organization or any ideology will participate very minimally. I mean, the majority of, for instance, Catholics, the majority of Catholics are kind of fair weather Catholics. They'll come on holidays and they'll hang out and they'll pray and whatever. But, the vast majority of people who identify as Catholic do not participate and attend in a regular and intense way. So they're not all kind of crazy, dogmatic Catholics. Most of them don't even adhere to the principles in any kind of strict way. So that's just one thing to keep in mind with these biases and stereotypes. Although we all have stereotypes, and we tend to group ourselves, evolutionarily speaking, based upon our biases and stereotypes, it does not mean that we all have the same core disgust for whatever group of people that our biases and stereotypes represent. So, again, simple example is African Americans have been viewed in this country for the last 150 years as property, as objects, as less than, as violent, and as dangerous, and all sorts of things, right? So there's a stereotype about that exists, right? And I'm writing about this in my book that's coming out in a couple of months. And the truth of the matter is, and the research shows, that the majority of people who are locked up for violent crime in this country, and this is a fact you can all go look at on the FBI, I believe it's the FBI's website, the majority of people who are locked up for violent crime are white people, believe it or not. And the majority of people who commit crimes against black people or black people. That's the second fact that you're not going to believe because it sounds so crazy. And the third fact is the majority of people who commit crimes against white people are white people. So if we're just talking about race and stereotypes and bias, believe it or not, we're the most, we, white, whatever you want to consider yourself, me, is the most violent group of people in this country. That's just what it is. Those are the facts. Those are facts you can check. Either you believe it or you don't. So that's just something to keep in mind. There are a lot of stereotypes, there are a lot of biases. We have to understand why they're there. And according to evolutionary psychology research, the reason they're there is to A, help us minimize our cognitive resources in social circumstances, and B, help us build group cohesion or keep our tribe together. Republicans band together. Gays band together. Straights band together. Religious people of whatever belief system band together. And that helps us survive because we feel safe when we're with like-minded people. So here's another interesting stereotype that I did some research on. And here's the proof that stereotypes are useful, I think. Although women are more active, for instance, in the US, where women's rights has been a big deal for the last over 100 years, although they play a more active role nowadays in many sectors of the workforce and get paid a lot more, comparatively speaking, and they operate in more positions of power, more CEOs and execs, the majority of men and women in this country still adhere to stereotypes about women as being more weak, more fragile, less boss-like, etc., etc. And the reason that a couple of studies pointed that out is because, evolutionarily speaking, seeing women in this way, in terms of their hormones, their genetics, their basic physical build, they have less dense bone mass, they have less muscle mass, etc., etc. It makes sense. If we start seeing them as strong as males, biological males, then we start to treat them differently in a way that might actually hurt them or it might help them. It's hard to know, but that's the evolutionary psychology thought process. Again, it's important to see people for how they're really built. And that is the goal of this talk today, is to talk about biases in a reasonable way, but also to say some bias is bad. Some stereotypes are only hurting people, and it's important for us to understand them and do something about them. Some other research facts you might find interesting in the consequences of bias and stereotypes. There is just a truckload of research that shows that bias in the legal system, in terms of race and things of that nature, is rampant. In terms of racial stereotypes about who's more violent, like I just talked about. I have a bunch of studies that show that. Another important thing is that people in the medical world and in the business world are more likely to utilize confirmation bias to make decisions. There's all sorts of research that shows top CEOs and physicians and psychologists and psychiatrists are very, very likely, more likely than the average person, to use confirmation bias, which I described earlier, to make decisions, especially if they're new to the game and they're younger. So what they find is more wise, more advanced CEOs, people who've been around for longer, older doctors, use confirmation bias less because they've seen the palette, the diversity of facts and things that might make diagnosing someone, for instance, more difficult, more challenging. There might be other factors at play. So it's important to keep that in mind as well. So let's talk about the brain and bias and why do we have it. So I'm sitting here saying stereotypes, confirmation bias, all these things are important. And it's built on a couple of basic areas in the brain. So we know that part of our dopamine system is responsible for amping us up to go seek out information. That's what it does, and there's research that shows that. We also know that our prefrontal cortex is responsible for putting two and two together, essentially. And there's also some temporal lobe on the side, memory-based processes that work together with our frontal lobe to either pop up one of these biases and use it as a framework for making decisions and thinking about things, or not. So if our frontal lobe, especially in terms of a not very active frontal lobe. So what the research shows is that a moderately active frontal lobe plus a moderately active certain temporal parietal areas for memories and feelings works together to help people use the heuristics and the bias and the stereotypes, which means we're not really critically thinking. We're thinking, but we're not critically thinking whenever we're using these biases and these stereotypes to relate to each other and make decisions about each other. Okay? So, again, it's important to check stereotypes and really understand the facts and statistics and things of that nature. Because, again, I'm going to post a bunch of research on the Patreon later that shows that there's a lot of potential harm to all sorts of groups of people in terms of inhibiting their progress and keeping us more divided in a tribalistic way, which I think is bad. If we continue to use confirmation bias, stereotypes, and things of that nature, and the research is all across issues of culture and race and gender and sexuality and age. Ageism is the thing. Thank you, Madonna. All sorts of things like that. So here are some real common sense solutions from the research about how to manage bias and stereotypes better. Because again, some of our stereotypes and our biases are bad, and they hurt people, and they create unnecessary divide between you and me, right? So again, like I said, for the example of race, there's this long-standing stereotype that African Americans are dangerous and bad and thugs and what have you. And unfortunately, in the media, thanks to the availability heuristic I talked about earlier, the media shows that to be true. The media will show all the bad and minimally show the good. News media in particular, so fuck them. Because that's my bias. So, but the facts show that white people tend to commit more crime that's violent and tend to kill more people, believe it or not. So, in order to confront these stereotypes, not that certain areas of the country aren't safe, like I live in Los Angeles. If I go to Compton, I might be more unsafe, on average, statistically speaking. A lot more unsafe than downtown, a lot more unsafe than Beverly Hills. Again, all these tribes live in different parts of the city, and I'm not necessarily appreciated in certain parts of the city. That's just how it is. Not because I'm bad, and not because they're bad. We all have our biases and our stereotypes that keep us feeling unsafe with each other. And in order to check those, this is what the research says works best. Okay? So 3 things, essentially, are the best ways for us to check our bias, whatever it is, whether it's race or sexuality or gender or politics or religion or whatever. If we're religious or not, racially motivated or not, does not matter. We need to check ourselves. We need to check ourselves often because that's critical thinking. And that's what we need to do more of in order to defeat the fear problem, which I'm talking about in my book. So the 3 things are this. We need to try preference inconsistent thinking, number 1. So preference inconsistent thinking is, just using the example of politics. Again, everyone in this country is just so up in arms about Donald Trump. Whether or not you like the guy, I don't care, because I don't care about him in the first place. But there seems to be a lot of negative bias, a lot of negative media, negative talk about the guy. And there's also a fair number of people who like the guy and speak up for him. In order for us to do preference inconsistent thinking, what we need to do is, whether or not we like him or not, if we're on the side of liking him, we need to check ourselves and go, okay, but these negative facts, these stories, whether or not they're true, are out there. What does it mean if these are true? And what is the likelihood that they're true? We need to think through all the quote-unquote negative facts that kind of challenge our bias towards liking the guy. And if you're a person who cannot stand Donald Trump for whatever reason, doesn't matter, you also need to check out with reality, okay, so let's just play it from the opposite side. What if he's actually a good guy, and what if all these things he's doing are actually for good purpose and not just because he's selfish or something like that, right? And we need to go down that rabbit hole in order to have a more even-minded approach towards him, towards the president, right? Again, this is not my personal opinion about the guy. I'm just saying, as an example, this is how we do preference inconsistent thinking. The second thing that the research shows that's very important for us to kind of break down our unhelpful stereotypes and our unhealthy bias is just contact with positive stereotypes about whatever the group of people. So again, my favorite example of this is, again, in this country, since there's always been a huge black and white divide, and I have the genetic experience of being white, thanks to my genes. So in order for me to, quote unquote, be less racist, even though I'm not in that regard, I would have to go hang out with positive stereotypes of African Americans. So I grew up in the South, and theoretically that means I should be a racist son of a bitch who hates black people, but I don't. I actually grew up with very moderate, understanding, loving Christian parents who said, love everyone, why the fuck does it matter? But if I were one of those crazy people like I used to hang out with when I was a kid, who really did hate black people, I would need to spend time with positive African American stereotypes. So one of my good friends in college was in a fraternity. He was really cool, and actually he took me to a couple of his chapter meetings, which was hilarious because I had never been to any fraternity anything in my life, and the fact that it was a black fraternity was fantastic because the sense of brotherhood was amazing, and I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. They're really cool people, super cool. Like, they were great guys, and they welcomed me in, and we hung out, and it was fun. So that would be an example of spending time in a positive stereotype, because again, there's a positive stereotype about African Americans being very family-oriented and being very brotherly, right? So I had that experience in college, and it was wonderful, and I loved every minute of it. Nice dude, super nice dude. Miss him. So contact with positive stereotypes is one of the ways that the research shows that we start to defeat our biases, and that's an example of it from my life. So the final thing, when we're engaging in a discussion with anyone, or we're meeting someone, or we're wary about someone, or we're engaging in one of the heuristics or one of the biases, or we are meeting someone who fits a stereotype, one of the best things we can do to get along with them and understand them better and challenge our bias is just use open-ended questions. Because it's easy to use very closed-ended questions like, what's your name, what do you do, da-da-da-da-da, and you get kind of a very simple, boring picture of a person, which might make it easier to confirm a stereotype. But if you use open-ended questions like, so what have you been up to today? Or what do you believe about this, this, and this topic? You might get a very nuanced view of the person, and it might challenge your stereotype. So these are the 3 research-based tools for breaking down stereotypes that are unhelpful and not good for us anymore, and for challenging our bias so that we can be more rational and more loving towards each other and not fight about stupid things like politics or religion or whatever. So we can just be there with each other and enjoy being with each other. But these are the 3 things that help, according to the research. Preference inconsistent thinking, contact with positive stereotypes from that culture or group or whatever who's different, and then open-ended questions when you're communicating with these people who are seemingly different than you. I hope this makes sense. I have gone on and on and on and on about this topic in almost 30 minutes, which is not my usual. I try and be shorter. But the reality is this is very important to me, and I've gotten all fired up about it because it's super important. We all have biases. We all have stereotypes in our head. We all have prejudices, we all have whatever. And to some extent, they're useful. And I want that to be clear. I'm going to say it again. To some extent, our biases and the stereotypes that we have are useful. They help us adhere to our tribe. They help us use fewer mental resources in challenging situations. So there is a usefulness to biases and stereotypes. I am not saying that we should go around adhering to stereotypes all day and being angry at whatever group of people for whatever stereotype it is, because that's stupid and that's illogical. What I'm saying is they serve a purpose, and in certain situations they will serve a very important purpose. I guarantee you, if you go to Pakistan right now and you see someone carrying an ISIS flag, you are definitely going to be afraid and have all sorts of negative stereotypes and biases about that person if you're from the United States, because we've been attacked by them, we've been threatened by them, and all sorts of things. So in that case, your bias and your stereotype in your head about that particular person being a terrorist is very important. It's probably going to keep you alive and tell you to get the fuck out of that part of Pakistan, if not get the fuck out of Pakistan in the first place. Okay? So they serve a purpose, but in situations where we're not being threatened, where our tribe is not being threatened, we don't need them. We don't need to adhere to them, especially in any strong way. So I hope this is all clear. I hope I've made myself transparent in a useful way. I hope you understand that I'm not some crazy prejudiced individual. I'm just trying to talk about the science of bias and stereotypes. And if you're in the media out there and you feel bad about what I've said about you, too bad. You guys aren't helping the world right now. Have a good day, guys. Appreciate you listening.